Thanks for coming to the session. It's my third time now in Belgrade, and I enjoy it a lot. I'm happy to be here, and it's certainly not my last time I'll be coming to this beautiful city. Today we have 1.5 hours, so that's a long time to listen. I will probably speak for about 45 minutes. Let's see how it goes. I also inserted some comics into my presentation to make it a little bit more entertaining for you, because that's a long time. Especially these days where we use digital media and typically only consume snippets of information, which kind of brings me to my talk today. I'd like to talk about digital media as a driver of change. And we heard a lot about change yesterday and the day before when it comes to political change, when it comes to societal change, when it comes to how democracies or political systems are modified, are totally under scrutiny and even turned down one day to the other. And there's a big role that social media plays in this. You know, once there was a big dream, a big hope. When social media first came, there was this vision that social media would help us everyone to become more engaged in politics, because it connects everyone to the political world and everyone can participate. That's totally different to the old days where you had to read a newspaper, or you had to watch television, or you had to write a letter to your local politician or to your newspaper. And now everyone can participate. Everyone can consume the news wherever and whenever you want. And you can voice your political opinion wherever and whenever you want. You can take part. You can become an actor yourself without a party. And this is what social media facilitates. So the hope when social media came up for democracy was that it makes us more engaged. It leads to a better democracy. That was the great hope. And you also see this in the literature. So the first studies on social media, digital media, they were all kind of driven by this idea that democracy will profit, especially in authoritarian regimes, and that the world will become a better place. That was the idea back in the days and in the early literature on that. It means, on the one hand, people, citizens across the world can become more politically engaged with the help of social media. At the same time, because they have all information at their fingertips, they're also more informed, more enlightened, better citizens. That was the hope. Is that really what has happened? Let's see. It's a kind of question for my talk. And you see this also reflected in the literature. When you look at mostly the early work on digital media, people were saying that increase the likelihood of all types of political participation, foster engagement, increase the levels of political participation, increase likelihood of participating in politics in other ways, capacity for civic engagement will be fostered, increase political engagement and participation, foster potential for political and civic engagement. Now, that's the early literature. And the idea and research was driven by this idea, and scholars were looking for evidence of this fact, that social media, when you think about the Arab Spring, for instance, there were papers published on that, the role of social media for uprisings, but even for phenomena like environmental protest and so on and so forth. And the literature is full of this. If we look deeper into this, we have to ask ourselves, okay, but when there is a relationship between digital media use and political participation, how can we explain this relationship? How can we explain that? So what are the mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms? Why would we actually be more likely to participate? And typically what we see in the literature are 3 different answers for this. So if you will, 3 different intertwined mechanisms. First of all, it's communication. Social media can make us more politically active because we have a bigger network, as in the older days. If you came from a smaller village somewhere, far outside Belgrade, you had your friends and your colleagues over there, and if you wanted to connect to someone else, you needed to call them and pick up your phone or write a letter. Today, you can connect to all people in the country who have similar interests than you, and even more so to all people who have similar interests in neighboring countries, in Austria, in Germany, wherever. So we can communicate, we can connect, and this makes us more politically active. And most importantly, what happens via digital media that we can also discuss. So you voice your opinion. You listen to the opinions of others. You like things. You share things. So the communicative aspect rises. And because of this communicative aspect, we become more politically active in terms of participation. That means we are more likely to vote. We are more likely to be politically engaged. No, we communicate more. That's why we participate more. And related to that, there's also the idea in the literature that when we express our opinions, this alone will also foster our political engagement in more classic terms, this act of expression. So if you go with your device and if you express your political opinion, you say something politically, this act of expression makes you more involved because you took a stand in front of others. It means there's no way back. If you say, I think this president is good or this candidate is very bad for the country, for whatever reason, you took a stand publicly in front of everyone in your network, and this alone makes you more active because, for instance, you would expect you need to defend your views, you need to act in line with what you have publicly said. That's a completely different thing than reading a newspaper, forming your opinion about any political party or candidate, and then casting a vote. If you express yourself, this act of expression makes us more active. The same in interpersonal communication. This is studied in social psychology. If we have interpersonal discussions with people, this act of discussing makes us much more secure and makes us much more active in the future as well. So this is one explanation, communication. The second explanation is learning. So the idea is here that social media makes us more politically engaged because we learn more information. We get more information, the information we're looking for, the information we need, as we need it, how we need it, by people whom we trust. That's a big difference compared to classical journalism. Who reads a newspaper? Who are the typically readers of a newspaper here in Belgrade? I mean, you can profile them with their socio-demographic characteristics, and I'm sure there's a profile. It's not the general population. It's a subset of the population. And with social media, everyone can be reached, and we all can learn. That's the idea, right? So we learn more, and when we learn more, we are more certain what our views and our opinions are, and that's why we are more likely to vote, right? So this whole competence, call it competence, this notion would assume that we are more knowledgeable, and that's why we participate more in politics, because we are simply more informed, better informed. That's the theoretical notion that we see in the literature. At the same time, we have a better feeling of efficacy. That means we believe that we can actually make a difference, that we are competent. We feel competent, and we can also make a difference. So competence is another key mechanism. Digital media use should foster participation because we feel more competent. And finally, it's motivation. That means we form goals, we are sparked, we are inspired, we are also emotions play a role, we become angry, our identities, our group identities are triggered, so we want to change something, we are motivated for a change. That means mobilization is driven by motivation aspects plays a big role, and digital media use heavily triggers this a motivational aspect, so we form our goals, we get effectively involved. Social media is an effect-based channel. It plays with effects, it's oftentimes visual, it's short, and the logic is if you want to be successful with a message, if you trigger effects, your message will be more successful. For instance, anger or enthusiasm in political campaigns play a big role in order to be forwarded, shared, and liked. That's the theory. So I think we can all agree there are good grounds to assume that digital media would lead to more participation because of three different, distinct but intertwined mechanisms that we can find in the literature. I'd like to answer to this question and revisit the evidence for this mechanism. And I'm doing this not with a philosophy approach. So I understand when I look at the program of the conference, there's a huge tradition also on philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. So I will not take a philosophical approach to this question. But of course, it touches upon questions of philosophy, what I will be talking about. Rather, I will take a social science approach. And that's also where I come from as a social scientist. And what we do in social science is we observe others. We observe what they do, and we typically do this via empirical methods. So we are empiricists. We work with empirical data, and we do this typically with different methods. Most of our surveys, where we ask people, okay, what is your social media use, all kinds of social media use, what is your level of participation? We either do this cross-sectionally at one point in time, or over time during an election, before the election, shortly before the election, after the election, over time, right? So then using statistical methods, we then see what is the relationship. If people are more likely to use social media, are they also become more likely to be active? Are they learning more? We use this with survey data. We test your knowledge. We ask knowledge. Who is the foreign minister of Serbia? What is the position of this party? Knowledge questions. You know, the idea is if you learn more with social media, you should also be able to answer these questions in a political campaign. You should be more knowledgeable. For instance, party positions. What is the position of this party? What is the position of this party on this topic? Right? You should actually know. We do experiments. In experiments, we randomly assign people to different groups. That means we give them different snippets of information. And because we do this randomly, we can have a causal inference. That's something that's otherwise very, very difficult to achieve. That means we randomly assign people to different conditions. One getting information A, and the other one's getting a different kind of information or different media sources. And then we measure the outcome, we measure the emotions, and so on and so forth. And because we randomly assign people to different conditions, all your individual characteristics like gender, your motivations, your newspaper use, your other are randomly distributed. And this way they cannot systematically influence the findings. That's the logic of the experiment. So we also do this, and we do meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is a method where we look at published studies, empirical studies that have observed a relationship between two variables, for instance. And then we see across studies, that means studies that are published in different contexts, different countries, different times, with different characteristics, we calculate an overall statistical effect across those studies, which is super interesting because then you can actually do something which you can never do in a single study. You can take into account all the complexity that you have because you can then see, okay, are the effects different for different countries, different methods, different populations, other different types of social media, and so on and so forth. You can't do this in a single study because the questionnaire would be too long. But in the meta-analysis, we take stock of the entire evidence. Typically, you do this in medicine. If you want to get a vaccine or a certain treatment, typically there are meta-analysis demonstrating the effectiveness of this treatment across studies, across populations. So we can be sure that the effect for your treatment is actually reliable and trustworthy and not just a coincidence. That means random, placebo, doesn't bring anything. So that's a meta-analysis, and that's the methods we work with. And today I will also present you research on these three different methods. Let's have a look at the empirical evidence. So mostly this is survey research, but also experimental research, also meta-analytical research. We see, in fact, that social media use is related to political participation. That's the evidence we see in the literature across the entire world, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in most of the Western countries, or most of the countries where the social science research is possible. We see that online and offline participation is fostered. Online meaning that people are more likely to participate using online media. They express their opinions, call for votes, and so on and so forth. The success of social movements and social movement research. Political protest has evidence for that social media is an important driver of political protest. And effective polarization, meaning that social media makes us effectively polarized, so we see the other group, the out group, as unwanted and far away from us in terms of effects, and as enemies, as very far from us. So that's strong evidence, I'd say, in the literature, and also in meta-analysis, we see that social media use promotes participation. We see this. Strong evidence is undeniable. According to the best evidence we have, we see that digital media, the more people use social media, digital media, the more likely they are to participate online and offline, and we have quite some evidence for that. So far, so good. So the story of the good social media that helps us to build a better democracy, so far it holds. And in the literature, when you look into this literature, the tone is enthusiastic. It says, that's great. I mean, great for democracy. For participatory democracy, that's good news. But what about learning? So we know it engages us, but what about being more informed, being more knowledgeable? And this is an entirely different perspective. So it can make us more likely to vote and more likely to voice our opinion and participate, but what about actual knowledge? And now, before answering this question, let us briefly think about why is this an important aspect? It is an important aspect because the whole idea of democracy is deliberation. So we see different sides, different opinions, we familiarize ourselves with them, and then we form an opinion and say, I'm for this party or for this party. That's the idea. It's not the idea that we exclusively see one side and have no choice. So the idea is to learn different arguments. That's democracy, different perspectives. That's the idea, deliberation. And then we decide what's best for me, what's best for you. And then the public vote decides, right? So knowledge is important. It's important. It should be an informed decision, not an uninformed decision. At least according to my understanding of democracy. It can be challenged, of course, can have a different opinion, but there would be an understanding that I think is important. And now you can have two different perspectives on this. There's one stream in the literature that argues, you know what? Never before was it easier for us to get quality political information. Whatever you want, you can get it at your fingertips, wherever you want, whenever you want it. It was never easier. It's no comparison to the old days. So of course we would assume that social media is a driver of political knowledge. Of course. Because it makes it much, much more easier. We don't have to watch the television news in the evening, and if we missed the show, then we missed the information. We can actually watch it whenever we want on our smartphone. We can learn about each other's opinion. So of course, it is, according to an optimistic view, much more likely that we also learn when we use more social media, right? And you have voices for this in literature. You look at this, just the Facebook book, right? So this cartoon with Facebook, traditionally very strong social media, right? Of course you can connect to so many people and you can reach so many people. And most importantly, and research also shows that, by the way, you can reach people that are actually uninterested in politics, who have tuned out. You will reach them via Facebook with political information because of their network, because some people in the network are politically interested. And so you share information. Whereas in the traditional world, you would read a newspaper or read a book in order to be informed. That's the optimistic view. What about the pessimistic view? The pessimistic view, there are a couple of arguments that you find in the literature. They take a completely different perspective. They say, well, you know, the problem is not the abundance of information, or if the abundance of information that you have on social media is actually a benefit, but also a challenge. Because there's so much information around that we are overloaded. It's so much that we cannot process it anymore. We cannot keep up. And there are studies actually showing evidence for this, that empirical studies in a team from Belgium, for instance, they say that they find that social media leads to an information overload. It's too much. And overload typically is something that you can't learn anything anymore because it's too much information. You learn less because you're overloaded with information. That's one view, information overload, or one argument why social media should not lead to learning. The second argument, a more pessimistic view, is distraction. Social media is not about politics. Social media, first, by and large, maybe for us, it's about politics, for us, but not the general population. You took the general population, it's entertainment. So it's sports. It's a lot of unpolitical things that are going on. So it prevents us from learning about political news because the other stuff that's going on is much more interesting. It's also on the internet. I mean, we all know that pornography is one of the biggest contents that are provided on the internet. It's not politics, right? So there's so much other interesting stuff going on social media at the same time, so which may distract us from political news because this other information is more rewarding and more attractive. And in fact, we did a study in Austria. I'm sorry that the font is too small, but it may not be necessary to read it. Where we did a study where we were looking into the audience, and we had two dimensions, kind of the political exposure, how strong are you exposed with political information on social media, and the entertainment exposure. And if you make this a 2x2 table, you can be high on both, you can be low on both. When you are low on both, you are inactive. When you are high on both, we would say you are distracted. If you are low on entertainment and high on politics, you are focused, right? So you don't care about the Kardashians, only political news, you are focused. And if you only care about the Kardashians but not about the news, you are the news avoider. So it's a simple categorization, right? 2 dimensions, it's simplified. But we see there's one group that is high on both. High use of entertainment-oriented information and political information. So, and what we see is that for those distracted, we actually see, and I'm going to explain it in a second, what you see here in a research study that we did, in a panel study that we did, we see that it actually can lead to distraction when we measure political interest as the outcome variable. And what you see here is political exposure, the effect of political exposure, always. And you see it for different levels of entertainment exposure. Entertainment exposure 1 to entertainment exposure 7. Entertainment exposure 1 would mean you see no entertainment. Entertainment exposure 7 would mean you see a lot of entertainment. And that you mean that the graph goes from this, right, to this. It means this means more political exposure, more interest, right? It's a positive relationship. More exposure, more interest. That's on the left side. And on the right graph, it's this, more political exposure leading to less interest. So we would interpret this as a distraction effect in our data. Of course, only one study, it's limited, and so on and so forth. But here you see that the more you use entertainment on top of political exposure, the less interest you have, at least in this study. So there are grounds for distraction. But it's not only distraction. Let's also put some more negative arguments here. Social media may also prevent us from learning because of the filtered media environment. That means, according to the idea of democracy, we said, we should learn different arguments. And if you watch a television news in Serbia, I would assume that the different parties get a voice. Of course, we know from research that the government gets more. The government always gets more share. That's everywhere. It's everywhere in the world. You see this in studies. We actually do research on this, so we see this. As a government, you get more quotes, more voice in the media, as always. But the opposition should at least occur. So you should be exposed to opposition parties as well. That's the idea, right? So in theory, or in a newspaper, you have several leanings in a newspaper, but it's difficult to completely tune out one side and only have a party newspaper for one party. So it's more difficult. You need to at least let some arguments flow on social media. But this idea is completely different, because based on 2 things, self-selection and algorithmic selection, we are more likely to see the news that we prefer. So self-selection means I'm not following you because you are from a different party. I don't want to see what you're saying. It annoys me to see your news, to see your views. I don't want to see this, right? Unfollow, out of my view, please. You can't do this in a newspaper. You would have to cut out the quotes, and you can't do that. So, but on social media, you're not out, please. And you follow actors from your party, from your network. And they will give you messages all the time from your perspective. So it's a filtered media environment. It's actually more narrow and not broad. But the idea of deliberation was broad. We get different perspectives. But now with social media, I'm able to filter out any other opposing voice that I don't want to see. And it even goes in friendships that you see. I don't want to follow in so-called weak ties. That means people that I know, but are not my closest friends or family members. That I say, okay, I know I've met you in Serbia, but you're sending me so much political news that I'm starting to unfollow you. I mean, I know you, but I'm not interested, right? So it's a filtered media environment, and it makes us more narrow in our views. In fact, there's evidence for that in the literature. The evidence says, in fact, you are more likely on social media to see like-minded views, but still it's not completely possible. The evidence is not completely as strong that we would say you also would not see any opposing news, any opposing views anymore. Because typically we have networks, but the networks are also our parents, our family members, and there you have diversity. You cannot exclude your mom or your dad from a network because they have a different opinion. That would be very rude. Or your best friend on your soccer team, or in whatever you do, you still leave them in. So there's still exposure there's still exposure. We see this evidence across the world to cross-cutting. That means to opposing information, you still get it. You can't completely tune it out, but the likelihood of like-minded information gets higher. There's 2 different things. More like-minded and less opposing. We see more like-minded. For the opposing, the evidence is less clear. You still get opposing news, but you see more like-minded news. That means filtered media environment. And you have voices on this who say, well, this is a problem for democracy because it's more filtered. Okay. And then finally, misinformation. That's a big topic. Social media prevents us from learning because it's actually false. It's really false. It's fake. It's of course, difficult discussion. What is false? What is not false? It's a difficult discussion, also in philosophical terms, I suppose. But we see evidence for this, that on social media, once misinformation is actually established, it's very difficult to correct. It's very difficult to correct misinformation. So once it sticks, and especially for polarized topics, right? And that's what also parties and political actors try to do. They try to make their audience immune against opposing information. So even if it's misinformation, and once people believe that, they are immune against correction because they think the correction is false. It's a lie. That it's deliberately, you don't believe it anymore. Oh, this is a university professor. They're all under the same, they're all typical, I have to be skeptical, right? Misinformation. We see strong evidence for this across the board. And finally, yes, social media is idealized self-disclosure, right? So we present ourselves in idealized ways on different networks like LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, even Tinder. That's also social media. And we present different parts of ourselves in an idealized way. And of course, the question can be, is this really related to political learning? However, and what we also see, we did a study in Austria among young voters. That's quite interesting. We often study young adolescents. And then we were actually looking in a mobile experience sampling study. That means we contact you during a day on your smartphone and we ask, in the last 2 hours, what kind of information did you have on your smartphone? Right? It's different than if we ask it in a survey. If you ask in a survey, people say, yeah, I saw news. But here, this is it's more close to the actual perception situation, right? So we asked them, what did you see on your smartphone? Young people in Austria. And of course, we as academics, we see a lot of academic stuff. We see a lot of political stuff. That's what we do. And 6% saw political news. Only 6% of our 15 to 20-year-old. It's many other computer games, many other contents they use on their smartphones. Only 6% was political. How can you learn if the majority of the information is apolitical, right? For younger vote. And we don't need to think about us. We may be different, but in the general population, the social media are used in other ways. How can you learn from that? So in summary, we know, according to the literature, that social media activates us politically. It activates us politically, but the evidence also in the first studies we have on evidence on that, it does not foster objective political knowledge, and some studies even show a negative effect on knowledge. So the more social media you use, the less you know. Some studies suggest that. It's a little bit unclear as of now. And it leads to, if you learn, it's more likely one-sided learning. So you learn more on your side, on your party, on your preference. And it can also strongly lead to learning of disinformation. And once disinformation is learned, it's difficult to correct. We know that. It sticks. It's difficult. It's easier to learn than to correct it. So when it comes to learning, we have to say, well, the evidence suggests that people on social media have a subjective sense of learning. So they say, I know what's going on. I'm well informed. But then when we ask knowledge questions in a survey to identify different arguments, what was discussed in this campaign? What were the arguments from this actor and from this actor? Just knowledge questions. These are tests, right? We don't see the evidence, also in our studies. So the people have the feeling to be informed on social media. They think, no, I'm well informed. I know all the important information. But in fact, they are not. That's what the research suggests. That's why we say, and I would say, it's an illusion to be informed. We think we are informed, but objectively we are not informed because we learn misinformation, we learn one-sided information, and we are distracted by many other things as well. And we see this that, particularly the younger generation, it's multitasking. So they would not read a newspaper or read something in a news article So they do other stuff besides. They all of a sudden, in similar terms, you also see this in class and maybe also in the room, and I also do that, right? So the whole habits have changed. How can we learn if we always jump from one snippet of information to the next? The illusion to be informed. There's still hope. There's one notion, I have many slides on this, but I try to make it shorter in the interest of time. There's one hope, there's still one hope, one aspect, one theoretical aspect that could still lead us to be more positive about this. And that's the notion of so-called incidental exposure. Incidental exposure means that, of course, we are in a filtered environment and there's misinformation and one-sided information, but a very typical feature of social media is that we get incidentally exposed to political news, although we don't want to see it. We didn't plan to do it. That's difficult. That's different from TV, where you typically watch the news intentionally, or you read a newspaper, you have to pay for it intentionally. You can't get incidentally exposed to political information. There's one exception, a very timely one. In Germany, they have the major news show between the two halves of the soccer game, right? So you have the first half of the soccer game, and then the news show, and then the second. That's the most watched news show in the country. So this should, because people just stick to the program. I don't know what they do, but they stick to the program, and you see in the numbers, this is when you see what are the most watched news shows in the entire year, it's those in between the half times of the soccer game. Not sure how it is in Serbia, but it's funny. So that's incidental exposure. You want to see a game, but you incidentally get political news, although you are not interested in it. And there are studies, it's ironically, that actually demonstrate that you still learn from this incidental exposure. So, and you learn as much as someone who also intentionally watched the news show. In social media, this is much more relevant because of our networks. You can't completely control your network. You have friends and family members. We have larger networks than as compared to the old days without social media. We have strong ties. We have also weak ties. That means some colleagues, people you see one or twice in the year, some friends from school, you're still connected with them on social media, but you don't know actually about what they do in a daily life or how they feel, but you still see what's going on, you observe their lives, and they share political information. They may share political news. That's called incidental exposure. It wasn't planned, and you still see it. And the idea is, okay, we know that social media doesn't really lead to learning, but maybe the incidental exposure, this notion of incidental exposure will save us and will lead to more learning, right? So we in Vienna, in my research group, we did a couple of studies on that, on the relationship between incidental exposure on social media and political participation and political learning. At the end of my talk, I just give you some snippets of findings, not all I have prepared here. So incidental exposure is defined as exposure to political information that individuals did not intend to be exposed to. It's a typical characteristic of social media. And first of all, we did a meta-analysis. I talked about this. So you take all the studies that you have, and then you calculate an average effect size across studies. You see, okay, how strong is the effect for all the studies? That's the accumulated evidence you have in social science. It's always the accumulation of findings that make sense. Not a single study is always problematic, but the accumulation of studies is the evidence, the best evidence that you can have. And we took different kinds of news. We measured, we coded for knowledge, we looked for effects on knowledge, participation, and so on and so forth in this meta-analysis. And we found there was a positive and significant relationship for most of the studies, and now it's getting methodological. In some research designs, you get higher relationships because they are less rigorous. So in cross-sectional studies, you cannot control third variables. You have stronger correlations, but the correlations may be flawed or may be misleading because you can't control other variables. So in cross-sectional research, we see a significant relationship, but this relationship is very, very small, still significant, if you take more conservative methods like panel studies. So it depends a little bit on the method, on the design that you use, what kind of effect you find. That's typically meta-analysis. So we can say, we learn, yes, we learn, but only a little, small effect. It's not that you learn nothing. No, we learn, but only a little bit. A little bit you learn from incidental exposure. So you can't completely say, if you get incidentally exposed to stuff, you take some of it. You scroll through your news feed and you see, okay, the president did this, or I like this argument. You simply screen it and you move on. So these snippets of information that you still get, by looking to your newsfeed, you still learn a little. But of course, not as much as you would read a newspaper, right? A little bit, show some evidence, a little evidence. But then we also do what we did, and now I'm making this very short, in interest of time. We developed a theoretical model where we said, well, incidental exposure, what actually is that? And we said there are two different types of incidental exposure. We call it first and second level. The first level would mean you incidentally see political news and you just ignore it, but you saw it. You cannot. It's like when you see an ad on the street. You still see it, but you ignore it. But you still know I saw something. That's first level. The second level is you see political snippet of information incidentally, but then you pay more attention to it. You change your processing goal, and then you read it more carefully. That also happens. So you see something. What we do on social media is we permanently scan the environment about relevance. What is relevant? Okay, what is relevant? Kardashians, president, what is relevant? And then we decide what is relevant and pay closer attention. So incidental exposure can also mean we change our our mode. It's not incidental anymore. We then pay closer attention and read it more carefully. And we said, of course, learning should be higher for the second level when you pay more careful attention as compared to the first level. We had a theoretical model about that and several studies. First level, second level incidental exposure. Let me cut this short. So we looked into this learning. So we had some items in the questionnaire. For instance, first level would be I stumbled upon political content, but did not really engage with it. And second level would be I saw political content incidentally and then looked at it more thoroughly. Right? So we asked this in a survey and relate this to learning. And what you see here is still in several panel studies that we did, published in Computers and Human Behavior. However, we didn't see evidence for static knowledge, which is more political classic knowledge. How many parties are in the parliament is static knowledge. And campaign knowledge is what did party X say in the campaign. So that's for both. We didn't see much evidence in several panel studies, and also another one on knowledge. No evidence in these several studies that we did in Austria and Germany. No evidence for learning. So even in meta-analysis, there's a small effect, but in our panel studies, we didn't see much of an effect. Then we did an experiment, and I skipped this short. Yeah, okay. You can say, well, yeah, that's panel, the survey research is limited. We always have this problem in social science research about the rigor of the methods. You can say, yeah, your research is limited, it's flawed, you can't ask those questions, it's self-report. All of this is, you can't do it like this. It's a typical discussion that we have about the methods. And then we say, no, we also did experimental studies, and in experiments, we can manipulate incidental exposure where we give you a goal. We say, can you please read about Red Star Belgrade? That's your goal. And this is your task, and then we incidentally put you also some political stuff inside that was not according to your goal, and then we measure how much did you learn. And we did this in experiments as well, and we saw that only the second level could lead to some significant learning. I cut this short. We saw that the second level, if you say you see something incidentally and then pay more attention to it, this significantly increases learning. The first level is still very small. If you see it in your newsfeed and you ignore it, you learn a very small amount of information only. You just scan your environment. So one could say we know what's going on, but we don't know the details. So to sum up, are we learning from social media? Are we more informed, or are we actually dumber? And the evidence that we have is that, well, yes, we are more informed, a little bit, perhaps. So we see that compared to classical news, someone who follows the classical news, the learning, and we have also lots of evidence on that, the learning from social media is very small. It's very small. It's snippets of information that you get. Even when you get it incidentally, a little bit of it sticks. Only if you then change your processing goal and then you pay attention more carefully and then you significantly learn. But apart from that, there is not strong evidence that social media really makes us more informed in terms of deliberative democracy. That's at least a conclusion in our team that we would draw from the available evidence. Its content is other groups and other researchers have a different interpretation and different data, but according to the evidence we have, we would say, yes, you're a little bit informed, but it's not really significant. So we can conclude that digital media use, concluding the evidence, we still see strong evidence on it leads to participation because of these network effects, the communicative effects, expression effects. We still see a lot of evidence when it comes to political participation because of effective mechanisms, because social media around protest, it really gets our group identity loaded up. It works, you know. So people become more active. We become more active. If you run a party these days, and if you want to be successful, you need social media to mobilize your voters, to control the information environment of your voters, and to kind of to increase or strengthen their group identity as members of the same group. In group, we all feel be members of the same group. This is what drives us to vote. This is what makes us engaged. I would say, according to evidence that we have, and then we see in the literature, but we are not more engaged because we are more knowledgeable. So we are more engaged, mostly because of our affects, but we are not more engaged because we learn more, we know more. So this vision that we have that social media makes us more engaged and more informed may not hold. I would say, in a nutshell, to close for today, social media leads to participation, but you could also call it blind participation, a little bit exaggerated. We're not totally blind, so don't quote me for this, but it a little bit resembles blind participation. At least statistically speaking, when we see the evidence that we have, people are more likely to participate. But what about the notion of deliberation? What about learning? And also a little bit more exaggerated, at the end, to spur the discussion, you could say, well, social media is not based on understanding or learning. Social media is based on emotions. It makes us either uninformed. It means we don't learn a lot, uninformed, so we learn only a little bit, right? Misinformed, we learn falsehoods or false information, or selectively informed. It means we learn, but only from one side, not from all sides. And I think this puts us in a serious dilemma. Because the future of campaigning is not, I would say, please contradict, the future of campaigning, the future of political campaigning is not television and newspapers anymore. It's social media. This is the future. And journalism is, I'm not sure about Serbia, but journalism is under high threat when it comes to this, because the mindset that we're having is, the news is for free on my smartphone every day. I don't want to pay for it. I don't see the purpose. I don't see the value of paying anything for this. And some people, younger ones, would even say, I don't need to follow the news actively. I have my network that shows me the news. I don't need any journalist. I'm now exaggerating a little bit, right? I have my network. I get all I need in my network. That's all I need. I don't need to do more. And with this, if you think about this mindset, how fundamentally our information environment has changed. Some of you may still remember the sound of a modem, right? When you log into sound of a modem, when you log into the internet, remember the sound. Younger generation said, "What are you talking about?" And this is old man's talk. It's totally irrelevant. The changes have been dramatic, very fast, and it's just a starting point. So in terms of learning and more deliberation and more information, I think it's a serious dilemma. Happy to receive different opinions and to discuss this with you. And to make us a little bit more happy in the end, I brought another comic. Not sure if you can read it. Why are you here? It says not you are here. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.